Thank you very much indeed. And a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a huge pleasure to see so many people here this morning, and not at all, of course, a surprise. We're all here to celebrate the professional life of Peter Morris, who's a surgeon, of course, of extraordinary distinction and one of the most universally celebrated transplant surgeons in the world. He was part of that early generation of transplant surgeons that grappled with the really difficult challenges that faced transplantation in those early days. And it's the contribution of those early surgeons and physicians that enables us to do what we do today. And Peter's particular contributions to transplantation were huge, both in the lab and in the clinic. He brought a rigorous scientific approach into surgical transplantation, and he brought basic science into surgery, and he turned it into a world-class scientific establishment. He left a huge legacy. My own, and I'm sure many of ours, strongest overriding recollection of Peter is his ability to relate to other people. Speaking personally, he was already a legend when I started training as a transplant surgeon in Cambridge in the 1980s. And my first encounter with him was in the context of the highly competitive annual sporting fixtures between the departments of surgery in the two institutions. And these were taken astonishingly seriously. But beyond the important business of working out which department could ski better or win at tennis, my abiding memory from those days is how he seemed to be interested in everyone, even down to the lowliest registrar on the opposing team. And when I moved to Oxford many years later, I realized this was combined with an extraordinary ability to know who everyone was, and extended not just to the junior doctors, but to the whole team, to the nurses, to the junior doctors, to the porters. He knew everyone's name, he knew what they did, and he valued them. Very, very strong impression. I'm personally enormously grateful to Peter because he was a major part. He facilitated my move to Oxford 24 years ago. And having arrived, I was extraordinarily fortunate to have the benefit of his support and his wisdom. He was always available for a chat, usually over a glass of wine or a curry. He was always there to help. He was never in the way. I believe there are around about 100 people here today, and collectively we have many different memories of Peter as a scientist, a surgeon, a leader, a mentor, a colleague, but above all, I think to all of us, he was an inspiration and he was a friend. So we're now going to hear from a series of speakers who will tell us about different facets of Peter's professional life from the earlier days of his time as Nuffield Professor of Surgery, all the way through to his role as President of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. So first, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Winearls, who led the renal medicine service here with great distinction for many years, but has even larger distinction in reference to today of being Peter's first Oxford PhD student in 1975. Chris.
Hello, everyone. Hello, particularly to Joss and the Morris family, who I got to know very early on too. I am actually very touched to be asked to speak at the celebration of Peter's life, but also at the celebration of the 5,000th transplant done in the Transplant Centre. I do recognise that the organisers had a bit of a Hobson's choice here, because I think I'm one of the few people who's still alive who was there in 1975. I'm always a bit worried about giving the first talk of the day, and I'll tell you a story. When John Faber and I were going down to the BTS, I think it was an Anglo-French meeting, and I'd got an abstract in, and I got a letter back saying I was the first speaker. And I said to John and to Peter, I said, oh, I'm the first speaker. And I think it was Peter who dissolved my delight when he said that this was only to avoid the late arrivals missing anything significant. Anyway, it got worse because Jean Ambouget, who was the chairman, the French chairman, when I'd finished, he said, what he said, that was the most fascinating talk. And I thought it was wonderful. Very pleased with myself. And then a question I was working on azathioprine came from a man called Jean-Francois Bach. And it was a very difficult question, and I thought I knew the answer, and I made it perfectly clear that I thought the answer was obvious. Anyway, I went and sat down. Peter Morris sitting next to me said, next time you want to take on someone, I would avoid Jean-Francois Bach. So I came back a humbler man, and of course it remains so. Let me tell you the story as I remember it, and I'm going to apologize now if I missed anybody. As you get older, you commit many acts of omission and fear of commission. In 1973, Peter would have been preparing to move here to Oxford. He was really invited to resurrect a completely moribund Nuffield Department of Surgery, and second, to set up a transplant service for the 6 counties, Oxford and its surrounding 5. Now, Oxford was very lucky to have recruited him, actually. He was a skilled surgeon, he was a clinical scientist, and he was a man who led by example and got things done. But of course, he must have recognized that Oxford gave him pretty big opportunities too. This was the place where Peter Medaway did his rabbit transplants after those terrible burns incidents during the people trying to find a solution to the burns of those RAF men. And actually, I had to read Medaway's papers in the Journal of Anatomy. And Gowans was here, you know, he'd worked on the lymphocyte traffic. And there was Rodney Porter, who'd, of course, discovered the structure of immunoglobulin. There was an MRC cellular immunology unit, and there was the Bodmer group working on HLA. But there was a vacuum in transplantation. Actually, kidney transplantation wasn't really particularly popular with nephrologists. The results were rather poor, but it was something that had to be developed. The outcomes were pretty modest, about 65% graft survival at 1 year. Lots of mysteries, lots of challenges. The alternative for the patients, of course, was this long-term home hemodialysis, which was pretty grim. 8 hours, 3 times a week to set your own machine up. You had to have a helper, and you didn't feel particularly great. But this unit was run by a formidable man who became a close friend and colleague of Peter's, Desmond Oliver, who was what they call in New Zealand an all-black wing forward. He was about 6'6" and not a man to be trifled with. He was struggling with the huge number of patients that the unit was growing, and there was no way out, really. The results were good, but we needed a transplant unit. So, in fact, that was a very great synergy, actually, between these 2 men, 2 powerful individuals, and they really needed each other. Well, Peter arrived in summer 74, immediately assembling a team. Now, I did say that there are not many of us survivors, but Wendy Pollock's here. Wendy was working in England, and he managed to, for a while, from Australia, and she'd worked with him in Melbourne, and she set up the tissue typing laboratories. He got for his first SHO. It was Chris Koo, later a very distinguished hand surgeon, Cambridge graduate from a very famous Singapore medical family. He got Michael Dunnell, who was a respiratory physiologist, to learn how to interpret renal biopsies. So he got this team together, but he had also the lovely Joan Cracknell, who some of you will remember, who was his fantastic secretary, because she could, you know, she was kind of keeping the traffic moving with Peter. I thought she was lovely, and particularly because, being a South African, I was about to be called up to go into the military, and I was in the middle of my DPhil, and I didn't want to fight on the previous strip, and B, I wanted to complete my DPhil. So I went to Joan, who would always tell you when it was a good time to speak to PJ, and now wasn't. So I said, can you just tell him to write letters to the Minister of Defence saying that I'm not available for service on the previous trip at the moment. So this letter came back, which I sent up, and it said, dear whatever, he said, Dr. Winearls is one of the most distinguished young scientists doing world-shattering work and whatever. Wow. The next time I saw PJ, I said, thank you very much, Neve. They're very supportive. He said, no, I didn't write it. He said, Joan wrote it. Anyway, he got cracking. He was allocated 4 beds on a medical ward. He wasn't given an outpatient. He was given a side room. And then he started working the patients up. They had to have burial meals in case they had duodenal ulcers, because bleeding duodenal ulcers was tickets for some transplant patients. He took a large number of kidneys out if they were infected or too large. Now, how did I meet him? Well, in 1974, I arrived, and I must say my meeting with Peter was a life-changing event. We had a few things in common. We were both from the old Commonwealth, him Australia and me from the Union of South Africa. We still refer to England as the mother country. Both our fathers had served in the Second World War. Both had had heart attacks. His sadly died, mine just survived. And we both had a passion for cricket. I'd always been interested in nephrology but didn't really know much about kidney transplantation. I was a student at UCT where, you know, there's a man called Christian Barnard who did the first heart transplant and then gathered air miles from there on. To my astonishment and to many others' astonishment, I was awarded a scholarship to Oxford. And arrived in 1974 in January. And Peter hadn't arrived yet, thank goodness, because you might have gone home, because there was a 3-day week, a miners' strike, and a hung parliament in February. It was a pretty difficult time, and I was looking forward to going home. The warden of Rhodes House, I won't name, was pretty hostile to me, but he did me one favour, which was to put me at the coming up dinner at Rhodes House next to Peter Morris. And Peter was having a whale of a time. There were 5 wines, there was port, and there was cigars. Now, I had a pretty Protestant background, and I had never drunk very much, just the odd shandy. You were drinking anyway. Peter Morris, really. Hi, I'm Peter Morris. And he said, what are you going to do? So I said, I'm not sure, because I was doing a house job, and I needed to decide what I was going to do with the scholarship. He said, come and see me. Anyway, I did remember the invitation, and it did come through, but I can tell you the next morning I thought I'd had a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Anyway, he invited me to be his first DPhil student, and life was never the same for me. I went over to the NDS labs, and there I met Wendy and Philippa Cullen, who was working on MLC, and Karen Williams on ADCC, and Judy McKenzie and Pat Mottram, his 2 microsurgeons, and I thought, I'm going to be happy here. I think I was lucky to get the DPhil because I didn't want to be a surgeon, but he forgave me that. I think someone must have told him about my 50-minute appendicectomy operation when I was a house surgeon in Northampton and decided the people of Oxford deserved better. He would, of course, have known that there had previously been some distinguished Rhodes Scholars, 2 from Australia, one from South Australia, who was Howard Florey, and then there was Hugh Cairns, who, of course, was the first Nuffield Professor of Surgery. So we didn't have a terribly bad reputation. Well, having got all his ducks in a row, on January the 30th, 1975, the balloon went up. A kidney had become available, and Geoffrey Slade, a home hemodialysis patient, was called in. Now, it was as if there would be, it was an international incident, I can tell you. The place was absolutely humming. Everybody was in. Matron came in, the professor of anesthetics came to give the anesthetic. Des Oliver came in, was doing potassiums every hour on the patient. And Peter was pretty calm, did the transplant, but it didn't work. And everyone was incredibly glum, except Peter. He said, oh, just wait and see. Anyway, calms down. Telephone call. There's another kidney available, and this is for Alan Newey. Well, Matron wasn't having this. She had a fit of the vapors. She said, we can't do that. My nurses are very tired. You know, we need a rest. We need a week's break between. Anyway, in came Alan Newey, and Alan had his transplant, and urine produced on the table. You know, fantastic. This urine bag filling in the operating theatre. It's a, you know, if you're a nephrologist, I could tell you that's a pretty sight. And you know that Jeff's transplant lasted 12, it woke up, and Peter used to, he knew that his wasn't working and Alan's was, and Peter went and consoled him. And then, of course, it started up, and Peter, as I say, did console him. Jeff's lasted 12 years, he had another, and Alan's lasted for 34 years. That was numbers 1 and 2. So the program had progressed, about 30 transplants done in the first year, and I think the reality then started to kick in, because those of you around in the 70s, transplantation was not plain sailing. Now, I remember Harold Macmillan, who was a Balliol College, came back and addressed the Rhodes Scholars. And he said something there, a joke against himself. He'd once in an election had said to the British people, "You've never had it so good." And he said this to all the scholars. He said, "You've never had it so good." Now, I was tempted to quote Macmillan to the current generation, say, "You've never had it so good," because, in fact, things were quite tough back in the 1970s. Remember, the 1-year graft survival was 65%, and 5-year was about 40%. The dialysis unit started filling up with sensitized patients. We had 2 drugs, azathioprine and prednisolone, and they weren't great. And the steroid doses were extremely high, and the patient got a lot of side effects, a lot of infections, what have you. Well, Peter, in his methodical way, set up a trial with low-dose steroids, and suddenly we had fewer steroid side effects. So that was a win. Acute rejection had one treatment, and that was 1 gram of methylprednisolone every 24 hours. Not a very nice treatment. Patients get very high, and it led to a lot of bone side effects in the younger patients. We were in a bind about blood transfusion because there was this great conundrum, which someone's going to explain to me one day, which is that Peter had noticed that in Melbourne, that patients who happened to have had transplants and then had to have blood transfusion and then had transplants did better than those that didn't have blood transfusions. So what are you to do? Are you to transfuse them, or are you to not transfuse them? Because if you transfuse them, you'll sensitize them. And we had a policy of no transfusion in Oxford, which was tough on the patients because many of them were anephric and EPO deficient, and they got extremely anemic. And we really didn't know what to do. And I often asked Peter, "What's the explanation?" And I got a whole lot of stuff about suppressor T cells and what have you, which I didn't think I really believed. Personally, I think it was the patients were selected. If they had a transfusion and been sensitized, then they wouldn't get a kidney with those epitopes. Anyway. The patients were pretty miserable. Thank goodness EPO came along and we solved that one, but it was pretty tough. The other thing we all dreaded was, there's a kidney for you, but we got to do the cross match. And the cross match came up positive, patient has to go home. And I know that Peter was pretty paranoid about positive cross matches because he'd worked in Virginia where they didn't know about cross matches and they were putting the kidneys in. And there's a story of him, the surgeon, very famous surgeon, his name, of course, has gone out of my head, who he worked with, put a kidney in, hyperacute rejection, took it out, put another one, hyperacute rejection. No, it's not working. So Peter then did all this work on antibodies, post-transplant and transfusion and pregnancy and what have you. But if you had a positive transplant remote or now, you didn't get it. So these patients were coming in all excited and didn't get it. Anyway, Peter and Alan Ting did quite a lot of very good work because what they did was sorted out what components of those serological positive cross matches were relevant by, for example, excluding the IgM autoantibodies and also finding that you could get away with transplanting people who had positive antibodies against the DR system as long as they didn't have antibodies against HLA class 1. And that was a big positive for us. The other thing was, winning the lottery is rather difficult, and getting a very well-matched kidney from the deceased donor pool is difficult. And he and Alan worked out that actually 2 DR matches was as good as many HLA class 1. And so that increased the number of patients who could get transplants. I'll tell you one thing we did learn a lot about in the early days was infection. And cytomegalovirus was the real challenge. And I think the people today who now have got solutions would know what it was like. These people started developing very high fevers, leukopenia, pneumonitis at about 6 weeks. And we had to wait for the virologist to tell us, yes, there's an IgM against CMV. You really only had one choice, and that was to reduce the immunosuppression. I'm afraid some patients died of that. We had 2 fantastic virologists, John Tobin and Mary Worrell, and they screened every single patient. They did their weekly CMV and antibodies and told us what was going on. Of course, now it's unbelievable. You have PCR, you get a result in the afternoon. They've got fantastic antivirals. There's techniques of giving CMV products. We also had pneumocystis. Now, when I qualified, pneumocystis was a protozoan. Well, there's been a sort of retro. It's now become fungus, and it used to be called Carinii, and it's now called Jirovecii. And that was horrible. People didn't tend to get better, and trials of cotrimoxazole prophylaxis put a stop to that. We also, in the unit, had an outbreak of Legionella because we isolated the patients, and the shower tanks had Legionella in them, which is why if you go around the hospital, you'll find, careful, this water is 60 degrees, because that was the only way to eliminate it. There was also one very horrible period, a lot of people have forgotten this, but Panorama saw fit to do a program called Is the Donor Really Dead? And, you know, I remember the program because there was this guy cycling around like this, and you know, he had been diagnosed as brain dead. Well, I don't know whether the producer of the program was brain dead, but the problem was that it was a rumor, and it put catabolic transplantation on the back foot for quite a long time. It's a big fight, but of course, once you give some bad news out there, it sticks. One of these tennis matches that Peter was referring to, I played tennis with Peter, but he always played Roy Kahn himself, and Roy Kahn was a bit shifty, really. He would find people who were not surgeons to come and play for him. They were county tennis players, so we didn't always win. Anyway, I shouldn't whinge. Anyway, at the end of the tennis match, we were taken into a seminar, and Roy Kahn shared the first cyclosporin database. God, we were socks went off them, and it was really effective, but they were in very high-risk patients. But he didn't seem to be terribly worried. There's a thing called nephrotoxicity. So and he's on just a mere 20 milligrams per kilogram of cyclosporin. And anyway, I think Peter said this is something, and he came back and did some testing in Oxford and made cyclosporin safer for UCO. We got used to handling the drug. And of course, it was a big step difference in results, 80% graft survival thereafter. Now, of course, I was a DPhil student, but he was fantastic with me. He would take me up to the unit, and I did a little bit of clinical work each week, and I used to do locums on the transplant unit as well. And even when he was very short-handed, I was allowed to assist him at operations. And he was extremely calm and courteous senior surgeon, and I don't think I cut too many of his little not too short or too long, which was the usual thing that housemen get shouted at for. Anyway, in the lab, there was lots going on. Peter and John Faber had set up in Melbourne a wonderful model of microsurgical kidney transplantation in rats, and he brought Judy McKenzie and Patrick Mottram over to do the microsurgery. So I went in there and I got trained. Now, I just want to tell you that those two women, their ischemia times were about 14 minutes. My personal best was 16, but mostly it was about 22. So that's one of the reasons I think I didn't become a surgeon. Anyway, my biopsies were beautifully prepared, cut and stained by Eleanor Drexler, who's sitting in the middle there, and went off to Peter Millard to be examined blind. I mean, he did look at them, but I mean, he didn't know what he was. Next door in the lab was Danny Finch isolating islets, and later with Derek Gray, and of course we're going to hear this afternoon about the human islet cell transplant program. John Faber was talked about, but we never saw him because he at the time was in the MRC cellular immunology unit, or he'd been in the Mackindoe Institute, but he was coming back to Oxford. And it was great to have him back because he acted as a mentor for me, helped me with my thesis and did immunochemistry and things like that. And he worked also with a chap called Derek Hart, who sadly has also died. And they did beautiful work on tissue distribution of MHC and other antigens. And it's lovely to see John and Clarissa here. Now, Andrew McMichael had a lab, and Andrew was interested in, am I going on too long? You want me to wrap up? I'm sorry. Well, Andrew was in the lab, and he was doing his work on T-cell recognition of virally infected cells. And he needed blood. He needs 60 mils of blood to pair these killer T cells. Well, there was this DPhil student down the bottom of the corridor. He was a homozygote for class 1 and 2. And he would take my blood regularly. And that's why I'm in nature, because my cells are called CW, and they're a superb killer cell, but I'm not an organ. John one day said, the excitement of being around at the time, John said to me, there's going to be a seminar, and just stop what you're doing. We're going to the Dunn School. And there was the presentation of the Doherty-Zinckernagel hypothesis, which at last told us what the HLA system was there for, not just to get in the way of transplant surgeons. Anyway, I think these early years illustrate the importance of teamwork. And Peter had his way of engaging people like Pierre Foy, the anaesthetist, and Wattie Fletcher, the radiologist, and Dr. Wright, and Mike Kettlewell, and Julian Britt, things that he didn't want to do. And it was a clinical study of patients, and things just got gradually better. And he had fantastic lab support as well. And so by 10 years, we could treat older and high-risk subjects like diabetics without the progress the hemodialysis unit would have drowned. Well, when I first came to Oxford, I marveled at the beautiful old buildings. Remember, I came from Cape Town, which was only settled in 1652. And I don't know when Australia was, but there were not many buildings that were as old as the ones here, very, very few. And they were all memorials to great people, they had names and what have you. Now, I think about the Oxford Transplant Centre as not like that. It's not a great big building. It's actually an institution. It's a group of people, and it's a group of team, and it's an ethos. But it may one day have its big building. It's thriving and even more successful today, thanks to the leadership in the Transplant Unit, Peter Friend and Rutger Klug. And I do want to pay tribute to my colleague Phil Mason, who joined us in 1995, who's been a fantastic transplant physician working on sensitized patients and ABO incompatibility. And their new leaders, and seen them today, Sanjay and Shrikant and Isabel Karoja. Now, to what do I attribute the success of this particular unit? Well, I think it is about continuity and leadership. And so I'm going to end on a waspish note. I was the second only clinical director of the Transplant Unit, and Peter Friend was second only and has recently retired. So I got onto Google and I found that in the same time that we've been just the two or the three, there have been 24 secretaries of state for health, actually. Makes this 2 a year, which is a bit like an SHO rotation. I think there's a message. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. And sorry, I did not wish to cramp your wonderful style. That was brilliant. The next speaker is Bob Montgomery. Bob Montgomery was in Oxford from 1989 to 92. He's gone on to a highly distinguished career. You will have seen Bob's name across the world's newspapers in recent months. I'm not going to give his CV because what we've asked Bob to do is to talk about what came next.
Well, good morning. So I was one of those lowly registrars and DPhil students under Prof. Morris, although he never made you feel that way, I can tell you that. So much of what I'm going to talk about, as you know, Peter gave me this title, is about myself, sadly. But I think, you know, the point of this talk is that you know, Peter Morris was a great man, but he was an individual, and there's only so much that any individual can do. But if you train the next generation of surgeons and physicians in transplantation, your legacy is duplicated thousands and thousands of times. And that's really, I think, one of the greatest legacies of Peter Morris. And we always said that Tom Starzl, he trained a lot of the great clinical surgeons, and Peter Morris trained the clinician scientists of the future. And if you look at the people who came here around the time that I was here from North America, they have made boundless and endless contributions to transplantation. And all those seeds were planted here, and you'll see that in what I'm going to talk about. So in the tribute to Peter Morris that was published in Transplantation, I had a little section about my years here, and the question was about the disruptive innovation that I've been involved with through the years, and how Peter Morris influenced that. And I'll just paraphrase. So Sir Peter Morris provided me with a truly remarkable example of a world-class academic transplant enterprise. I spent the last 35 years trying, with very limited success, to recreate the vision and culture that Prof. Morris mastered during those halcyon days in Oxford. Peter Morris knew the magic would happen organically if you just assembled the greatest talent available from all over the world, by the way, and gave them the resources and provided the vision. It is both at the same time so simple and yet so hard to achieve. So what was the secret sauce of the NDS when I was here? Well, I think that Prof, provided that model of a surgeon scientist, observing and identifying the unmet needs and unanswered questions in clinical transplantation, and then developing them into themes that would define the research portfolio of the department. And he understood that science was best carried out by full-time scientists in close collaboration with clinical scientists. Academic transplant clinicians needed to have exposure and experience in basic sciences. He believed that even if you weren't going to be working in a laboratory for the rest of your career, you had to understand the scientific process, and you had to understand what the people working in your department who were doing basic science were actually doing and understand it. A premium was placed on the proper training of the next generation, those who would contribute significantly to the science and practice from around the world. And when I was here, his laboratories were filled with people from everywhere on the planet. And it was the most exciting and the most amazing environment I've ever worked in since. Now, there were a few things that he probably got wrong. And some of those seeds, again, were planted in my mind, and they were things that I took up when I left here. So any reference to the mythical T suppressor cell was met with ridicule and quite a bit of laughter. I think maybe they were talking about Treg cells. And transplant immunology had one principal actor, and it was the T cell, and one best supporting actor, and that was the antigen presenting cell. And the humoral part of the immune system was just something that you wanted to avoid. And certainly I've spent a lot of my career on that part of immunology. And he had a healthy skepticism for xenotransplantation. I remember when he came back from a meeting in North America where Jane Goodall had shown a video about primates and how human-like they were. And I remember him saying to me that we'll never use primate organs, we'll never use primates as donors. He said there wasn't a dry eye in the entire place when she finished her talk. Now, I came here, and I don't know, maybe a few of you know my personal story, but at a very vulnerable time in my life. And I won't go into any detail, except to say that I had lost my father about 12 years before to cardiomyopathy, which they thought was post-viral. But then not long before I came over here, I got a phone call from my sister-in-law that my brother had just dropped dead from the same disease, as it turned out. So we had a bit of a nightmare on our hands in our family, and I inherited this genetic disorder. And when they put me on a treadmill, I had ventricular tachycardia at the age of 27, and I was the first surgeon in the world to have a defibrillator placed. And they thought that that wasn't compatible with being a surgeon. And right after, 2 months after I had the defibrillator placed, it was a huge size of a Coca-Cola can implanted in my abdomen, had to have my chest opened and capacitors put around the heart. And I came over here and I think I wrote to Prof before I came and told him about what had happened. And I think most people would have said, this isn't such a good idea. But this potentially could have been my future. And I knew that at the time, that I might not be able to finish my training And all I wanted to do was to be near Peter Morris to, learn some science so that maybe that would be my career in the future. But fortunately, I was able to train as a transplant surgeon, and the rest of this timeline sort of is history, but I had a heart transplant 5 years ago. I just had my 5th anniversary. But I think the compassion and grace that he showed me was, something that I'll never forget. So after I finished here and went back to Hopkins, as actually as a fellow, I got hooked up with these two characters, Lloyd Ratner and Lou Cavusi, and based on a survey that we had done of people who had decided during the process of becoming a donor not to donate, it turned out that the #1 reason that they decided to back out was because of the magnitude of the operation. And so we tried to address that by using the minimally invasive techniques that were just beginning to be developed at that time onto the donor operation. Frequently, and you'll all remember this, the donors would go home after the recipients with living kidney donation. And so we developed this procedure. And the first series of patients that we did, we submitted for publication. Now, you have to remember that the peer review system defends the current paradigm and favors the status quo, because the people who are reading the papers, their whole careers have been invested in the current paradigm. And so when we submitted this to the US Bureau of Transplantation, it was turned down by the editors. It wasn't even sent out for review. And this is what was said. This is a bad thing for transplantation. A safe donor operation has been around for 40 years. Why would anyone want to change that? It was turned down. I called Prof and said, would you have a look at this manuscript? And this is what, we've been up to. And he got back to me and he said, I actually don't agree with what you're doing. I don't think it's a good idea, but I think it should be aired and that people should be able to, make their own decision about it. So he took it through the European Bureau, and 2 reviews came back, 1 thumbs down and 1 thumbs up. The thumbs down one said the same things that the editors had. And he made an editorial decision to publish it. And that was the first big break, in my career. And again, even though I had left Oxford, he was still there, watching over me. You're all aware of the big contribution that Paul Terasaki made in the late 60s. And it ended hyperacute rejection, but sadly, it created this group of people who were warehoused on transplant lists throughout the world who were sensitized. And that was the next thing we took on and developed this protocol for desensitization in the late 90s. And you could use this for both HLA incompatible and ABO incompatible transplantation and involved plasmapheresis and a cocktail of drugs. It actually worked quite well. In these 2 studies that we did, one was a single center study at Johns Hopkins, and the other was a multi-center trial in North America involving 22 centers. We just looked at something very simple, which was patient survival over an 8-year period. And we found matched controls, that were very similar to the patients that we had desensitized and transplanted, which is that top line. And 86% of the patients who waited on the list for 8 years never got transplanted. 14% did get transplanted, and they did a bit better. But for the vast majority of people who were highly sensitized, you were on dialysis the whole time. So that's this group. And at the end of 8 years, only 30% of the people were alive. And 80% of the people we desensitized were alive. 30% is as bad as most cancers. So we were dealing with a highly lethal disease, sensitization. This woman showed up at our institution in 1989, and she had heard about the laparoscopic nephrectomy. So you see how these things kind of multiply. Lloyd Ratner had given a lecture at her institution. She was a transplant coordinator. And she came and said she was the first person to do this. I want to donate my kidney to anyone who needs it. So she was the first. I mean, I think all donors are altruistic. We'll say a non-directed donor. And we gave her kidney to a child because they're the most impacted by kidney disease. And she brought a publicist with her, and she wanted to start a revolution. The next day after her surgery, 50 people called and said, we want to give our kidneys too. So we did. There was no system for allocating these organs, so we just gave them to children, and then we transplanted our whole pediatric list, and we didn't know what to do at that point. And we came up with this eureka moment, this very simple thing where, because we were doing desensitization at the time, the non-directed donor would give their kidney to somebody who had an incompatible donor, either blood type or HLA incompatible, and that donor would give to somebody at the top of the list. But of course, this could be extended for many iterations and paced over a period of time. And that's what you see here. And the kidneys could be flown from one center to another on commercial airliners. And so this started the whole concept of chains of transplants and kidney pair donation. Now, where did this go? Well, this gentleman who had a daughter who had kidney disease and he wanted to give his kidney to her, but was incompatible. He was a finance guy on Wall Street, and he just completely stopped doing what he was doing and decided he was going to scale this simple idea that we had come up with into something really major. So this past year, 1,500 transplants that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for pair donation occurred in the US. Now, sadly, though, over that whole period of time, in this line right here, the number of live donor transplants, despite kidney pair donation, despite the laparoscopic technique, totally a flat line, 5,000 live donor transplants a year. Very kind of depressing. Now, there was an increase in the number of deceased donors, but sadly, a lot of those donors now were fentanyl overdose victims in the US, and 25% of them had hepatitis C from using IV drugs. And so we developed at Hopkins, these two individuals, surgeon and infectious disease doc, this concept of purposely giving somebody hepatitis C because there weren't enough recipients for hepatitis C positive organs, because we would only put them previously into hepatitis C positive recipients. And now we had all these donors and very few recipients. We were discarding 50% of these perfectly good organs, usually from young people. And so these new direct acting antivirals had come out that had a 95% cure rate. So the idea was you give the person a hepatitis C positive kidney, and then you give them the drug, and within 2 months, you're likely to cure them. And that's how I received my heart. When I went to NYU, I brought that protocol with me. We applied it across all the transplant organs, and I became a subject in my own study. And over the next 2.5 years, we did almost 250 transplants from hepatitis C positive into hepatitis C negative. Now, hepatitis C is about to be a thing of the past. So we won't have this, this particular bonus much going forward. Now, so I told you that living donation, despite these things that we had done, really hadn't changed. This guy is a Hungarian mathematician who, at the end of World War II, this is the plane that my father flew in World War II. It's a B-29, very slow, heavy bomber. Toward the end in the South Pacific, the mortality rate was 70% for the crews on these planes. somehow my dad survived that only to die of this genetic disease. But and they asked him, the Air Force asked him and a team of engineers to look at the airplanes that were returning to the field where the bullet holes, and to put armor, more armor in those areas. Well, he being a mathematician and a bright man, said, "You're asking the wrong question, because these are the planes that have returned. And so, in fact, we should be putting the armor where the bullet holes aren't, right? Because those are the planes that are at the bottom of the South Pacific." And he came up with this whole concept of survivorship bias. And I think we are victims of that in transplantation, because we have excellent results now. You heard about the early years. Now we have great results. You get a kidney transplant, you have a 97% chance at the end of 1 year being alive and having a functioning kidney. Problem is, only a very few number receive those organs, because we've got a terrible problem with organ supply. There are 1 million people in the US diagnosed every year with heart failure. Heart failure has a 50% mortality in 5 years. We did less than 4,000 heart transplants next year. Tremendous number of people are dying of heart failure without a transplant. Those who make it, are lucky enough to make it onto the list, only 1/3 of them will actually ever receive a transplant. And so that's a really staggering statistic as well. And so what I've really tried to focus on these last years is finding another source of organs, because this dearth in the organ supply is something that is the major cause of death in the US. And so we've done this using genetically edited pigs, and we've used the models to test them, because for 30 or 40 years, all of the research that had been done in xenotransplantation had been done in primates that receiving xeno organs, mostly from pigs. And now we have the ability to knock in and knock out genes with some ease. But we were no closer to a pathway for a clinical trial, for a phase 1 trial, than we were 40 years ago. So why was that? Because it's complicated, right? You have an organ from another species that's been genetically edited. The pigs have been cloned. They carry some risk of infectious disease. The FDA just doesn't know what to do with it. So we and others came up with this idea how to get these organs into humans for the first time. And the idea was to put them in a person who had wanted to donate their organs, but their organs weren't suitable for transplantation. Their hearts were beating and they were being maintained on a ventilator. And so they would basically donate their whole body for the purpose of testing these organs. And so that's what we have been up to. Now, the thing that has held xenotransplant back is that there's a carbohydrate that's expressed in pigs that was lost during evolution to humans. It's called alpha-gal. So it's on every cell in the pig. We have a pseudogene for alpha-gal, but there's an epitope on alpha-gal that cross-reacts with the surface of bacteria. So our immune system is primed against this carbohydrate. In fact, 1% of our total IgG is directed against this carbohydrate, if you can believe that. And that causes hyperacute rejection, has been the barrier for xenotransplantation. Just by knocking out that one gene in the pig and creating a alpha-gal free pig, which is on the right side, you can get a healthy transplant. And that's what we did in 2021. And we tested it in a decedent, someone who is brain dead by neurologic criteria, and we put the kidney in the groin rather than where we usually put the kidney. So because we only had permission to do this for 3 days, so we could observe it and biopsy it. This is the second time. We also transplanted the thymus underneath the capsule of the kidney. You can see on the left side of the screen this little triangle here is the thymus from the pig. And the group at Columbia had shown that deleted T cells that were being raised, in the human by the human immune system against the antigens, the novel pig antigens. And so, my DPhil thesis was all about the thymus and thymus ontogeny. So I was able to harken back to my early days. And the short of this is we didn't see any evidence of hyperacute rejection. We didn't see any evidence of antibody-mediated rejection. The kids function, or the kidneys function perfectly for those 3 days. There was some early signals of an innate response in the glomerulus to NK cells infiltrating and producing transcripts that were concerning for an early activation, as well as monocytes. And I'll just go through this quickly. These are 2 hearts that heart transplants we performed in decedents, again, for 3 days. You can see that's a pig heart that's been genetically modified. This time we had 10 different gene edits, because based on the primate work, it looked like the heart was much more difficult to get acceptance in. You can see the echocardiograms on the right side. And we had 3 of these carbohydrate knockouts, including alpha-gal, the important one, and 6 transgenes that involve different systemic pathways where the pig and human protein don't seem to interact in an efficient way. And these are important regulatory genes. And so we put the human transgenes into the pig genome. And so we did that for 3 days. And what you probably have heard about is our most recent study, where we kept one of these decedents on a ventilator with pretty normal hemodynamics for 61 days. We took the decedent's kidneys out so that they were completely dependent on the pig kidney. This was an alpha-gal knockout, thymo kidney again. You can see the thymus there underneath the capsule of the kidney, next to the kidney tissue. And guess what? It worked great. And I know I'm at the end of my time, so I'm just going to flip through these. We used only drugs that are available that we use in allotransplantation, so no experimental drugs. We found a very interesting phenotype that harkened back to that transcriptome work that I showed you earlier, that involved mainly the glomerulus, not the tubular area or the interstitium. There was never any infiltrate. And there was some activation of complement. And we did get a rejection episode during the 2nd month at about 6 weeks, where there was glomerulitis and C4D deposition. And again, this very unusual glomerular phenotype that involves IgA, involves complement activation, and a lot of things that we don't fully understand. But at the end of all of it, after using plasmapheresis and some of those techniques that I showed you earlier to combat antibody-mediated rejection, we got a kidney with a creatinine clearance of 150. So pigs actually have with both kidneys, a creatinine clearance of about 250, so about twice what humans have. So this kidney was essentially doing the work that's a higher creatinine clearance than you see in most humans. So at the end of the 2 months, perfectly great function. And we had completely turned around the rejection episode. So, I think what this demonstrated is there are a lot of things that we need to learn, because there's this unusual phenotype, but we were able to use standard procedures to treat a rejection episode and completely turn it around. And so I think the future is very bright. These are all the people who are involved in that work. And I just want to mention at the very end that one of the greatest thrills in my life, which just happened on the day September 21st, which was the 5th anniversary of my heart transplant, I received Order of Merit medal from President Zelensky for the transplants that I've been doing. In fact, I came here from Ukraine, over the past year and a half since the war started. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, I think, what this really, illustrates, and there are many other stories like mine out there, is just the impact that Peter Morris had on the next generation of surgeons and physicians.
Very much indeed. Very exciting developments. We're going to hear a lot more about that in the future, we know. Congratulations. Our last speaker before the coffee break is Chris Darby. Chris was a registrar here in Oxford under Peter Morris's jurisdiction in the 1980s, and he's going to tell us about his experiences.
Wow, so following on, I think about survivor bias because I've been swimming in this pool of very clever people for a long time, and I didn't train in Oxford, and I'm seeing some of the people where I have some significant moments of PTSD in a good. I can name a few, like Doc Kettlewell and Joe Smith, president of the GMC. So I can't cover the whole of the his clinical career, and I'm glad to see that there's bits. The NDS is coming later, so I'm going to really just keep this quite brief and really my feelings about Prof. You see, Prof came in; it just came naturally, didn't it? Prof to us all. So it's my recollections and how I see him in my context of my career, if you like. So to do that, I just need to tell you where I started so that you can see where my biases or philosophies come from. So I actually had my first transplant experience working in Cambridge with Roy Khan as an SHO. So this is another sort of wow atmosphere to work in. And just even those days, obviously significantly later than the early days, there were Scribner shunts and things like this, which are, I remember, it's not going to work here. That one, sorry. These horrible things and like that. And I remember we were putting paper clips on people's backs with tape, sending them for a plain x-ray, and then they come back to the ward and we do a kidney biopsy through the back relative to where the paper clips were. So even then, I can't imagine what it was like. You go back a decade or more to the early days. And there was a very clever chap here called Herman Waldman who was doing monoclonal antibodies. There was this chap here, Peter Friend, who was working in the lab. And I'm not going to tell the story, okay? Because I'm not quite sure what the regulatory atmosphere was for that. But Peter Friend had two things. One is he was working in the lab on antibodies. And secondly, he was the policeman for the SHOs to make sure that they got the beer ready for the daily ward round at 5, which he would come and check that he had got the beer ready, because otherwise Khan would be disturbed, or his career would be Peter's career. So the atmosphere here actually was quite different, I thought, to Oxford. When I came back later into Oxford, the Khan style was very much more, let's go for it, less n=1, we'll do something off-label and get on with it. And that I could see that. And if you look at his story, with some of the early drugs, 6-mercaptopurine, which became azathioprine when it was modified, cyclosporin, he definitely went for it pretty early on. And the word on the street was that cyclosporin was pretty toxic in dogs. And that doesn't seem to come through when you look at the papers, but basically he just moved on anyway. and I'm saying this because it's sort of compare and contrast a bit when you come to Oxford. So this is the sort of, this is a graph from 1978. So it was great because now you're getting big registry data with big numbers here. And just to give you, so in those days, things had improved from the Chris Winearls era that right at the start here. But if you look at graft survival in, this is just in cadaveric. This is graft survival in 1HLA haplotype match. So these are people from parent donor. And then these are identical HLA. So there's obviously something, there was always something a little bit more going on, even in the HLA major antigens. And that became part of the work that Peter has done and Sue Fugel was doing on minor antigens, etc. So this was the sort of where it was starting to improve. But the good thing is, because the incident rates of problems, infections, rejection were quite high, you could do studies in relatively, what we would say now, small numbers. So this, I would say, was the sort of illustrative of the Morris philosophy, which was small. So this is a proper study, if you like, 64, 65 patients. You could do that when you have 50% rejection rates and things like that. And when you have survival, so this graph is just bent on the, it doesn't actually improve. We've got to are not that good, but was actually resurrecting patients here. And this shows a study, a nice neat study. This is prednisolone and azathioprine, and this is cyclosporin for 3 months, and then converting back just to prednisolone, azathioprine. And this sort of neat, small study, small, critical question, but very neatly packaged, getting a clean answer. I would say that this is what I saw in Prof. Morris. And I think that's part of his legacy. And there were people around. So I am old enough, though I'm still actually working, to know and actually have worked. So Des Oliver was there, as you say, this big New Zealand All Black. And I was amazed and fascinated that he was doing all the AV fistulas at that time, which was like, okay, this is interesting nephrology. Chris Winearls was there. At this, Alan Ting was there. I didn't understand a word he was saying. I would sit at meeting, like you do as a junior, and I have no idea what you're talking about. Mike Dunnell was doing the histology. David Cranston was around. Actually, I came across him when I was a registrar, and he was a senior registrar in neurology. And David, you're going to hear from, but he was just the great calm person that had the continuity because we were inverted commas juniors together. We haven't heard much mention of Derek Gray. Sadly, Derek Gray, he was the professor of transplant, and he died early. And he was a real mainstay, of providing the day-to-day work, but also had a great work with the islet cell isolation, and was a major player in that. So coming on to some of my sort of, it may look like I'm traumatized because a lot of the stories are like swimming with these people. So I came to do an MD thesis in transplant immunology with Catherine Wood and Peter Morris. And I didn't know much about transplant immunology. I was interested in the clinical side, but this was definitely going to be a bit out of my league. So I was persuaded or encouraged to apply for a Wellcome grant. And I was going to have to go to the Wellcome Foundation and explain why I was going to do this work in mice with mouse heart transplant model using monoclonal antibodies and tolerance induction, etc. So then you said, right, so you're going to have a mock interview with Catherine Wood and Peter Morris. And I really hadn't had much one-to-one with Peter Morris. And they sat me down in the NDS library and they completely destroyed me. So that was okay. And they said, Peter said, well, it's just not good enough. And you need to come back and we'll do it all again. So we did all again. And that, so, to me, that is his hands-on. You know, we heard earlier that he takes an individual interest. He wasn't a person in the background. He was incredibly busy. He was fantastically policed by another scary person, actually, Joan Cracknell. I had completely forgotten about. But to get past her was, you know, a miracle of political maneuver. Then Brennan. But when you got there, Peter would spend his individual time with you. He would know what you were doing. And this was a very good example. And all the people who were doing the thesis, he would have an individual input to, and he would know what you were doing. And you knew that he knew what you were doing in the background. So there was very effective man. So this is a very famous slide, which has already been, because this is a major part of the Prof. Morris eco sphere, if you like, was the sport. So he was a very good cricketer, but he was good at lots of things, and he represented Australia at cricket. And he was good at tennis. I don't know who won these matches. Does anybody?
Cambridge.
Yes, but that was because they were ringlets. But what about the 1-to-1?
Well, it's about 50-50 actually.
Okay.
You needed to have a defibrillator actually.
There was something about these professors who, so Han was very good at squash, and he would play you as the SHO. So this is like another career event. So like problem. So you were terrified. Oh my God, I can't beat him or whatever. But actually, there wasn't a question, because the minute you got on the squash court, he completely wiped out you on the spy squash. So that was fine. So that's ritual sort of humiliation, but a better career move. More dangerous is the Oxford NDM cricket match, because if you were selected to play for this was a great honor, but you definitely didn't want to bat with Peter Morris, because he was extremely good at batting still, but he didn't understand that he couldn't run to the other end as fast as he remembered. So it was always a run out event in bowling, and that's exactly what happened to me. And I was standing at one end and the ball was hit, and I thought, we're going to run, but he's running to the safe end, so I'll be run out, so that's fine. And the junior in the Nuffield Park Mortentsen throws the ball way over my head to the far end and runs out Peter Morris. And I thought, it's all over. And there was a similar with God. He was interacting with us all, you know, whichever level we were, he was interacting. There was a multi-dimensions to the man. And, you know, I think that's a great plus for him. So just going a bit more serious again, he was clearly very structured. He knew where he was going. He gathered a very strong team of people around him, but he really knew what he was doing. And I did feel that he was quite different from the Khan. Oxford was very structured, very evidence-based, and I think people find that easy to work within that, because he was very, very consistent as a person and as a scientist. And people will talk about the NDS, but just a little bit about on his ethical side. It was interesting on the vascular side that, you know, he didn't feel people should be doing private practice, and if they did do private practice, or people had vascular ultrasound scans and things like that, then the money went into the famous Nuffield Department Surgery Fund to fund other events. And that had an impact on the way people worked around him, and also whether they actually stayed and worked in Oxford or not. But he had that was it. That was how it was going to be. And similarly, if you did research, for instance, I was using a charity welcome fund, you were not expected to do locums in, to increase your or keep your mortgage going or whatever, because he said, this was charitable money. It's being given to you. And if you do a locum and you come to the lab the next morning tired, that is not what those people understood when they gave that money. And so doing locums, and that was quite challenging for a lot of people because they were doing research, but no on calls and things, so their salaries were down. But it reflects on him. That's how he believed, and I think he was obviously right. And then he would read your publications, and you would have to go into the office if you got past Joan Cranknell. Sometimes there was a queue. It's like a snake coming out of his office. And the other thing he did, which is very clever, is that he would come back a day before he actually told anyone who was back, and he would hide in the office. He'd come in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and Joan Cranknell would say he's not here. But I learned later that he was. He was in there. I don't know whether he had a pee bottle or something, but how he didn't come out. He could have had a packed lunch, but he would, and he'd get one day done before anyone realized it was there. Otherwise, Peter, it was just a queue, wasn't it? A queue of people. So it said in his obituary that he had a greater than 800 publications. So I haven't checked through them all, but I did have a look for this talk, and I did think they all look pretty reasonable and acceptable. And I know he was involved in it, but this one caught my eye. And this is actually a book, a published book. And I thought, really? Because it was after he'd retired, so I wasn't sure whether he'd sort of, but no, this is actually an anaesthetist. So 2 or 3 years ago. But anyway, I thought, okay, this is a dimension that I didn't know. So we're not going to talk about this because it's going to come up, but this man was a great man, the Medawar Prize, and he was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society in '94. And I do have an anecdote to do with this, which reflects again on his personality, because in 1999, the physicist who proposed him for to be a fellow had a kidney transplant, but then he was found to have an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which is my other specialty, so in vascular, and he needed the aortic aneurysm repair. And I said, well, what I'm going to do is, I've got a special thing I've developed. I'm going to put the leg with the kidney on isolated perfusion bypass in a pediatric circuit, and we're going to cool the leg and that kidney and keep the kidney perfused, pulsatile perfusion with cold fluid. Now, nobody else was ever doing that, I suspect. And he just looked at me, and I thought, this is the moment. This is his best friend person from the fellow, and he goes, "Good luck," like that. And then I thought, fine. And then at home, the night before the operation, the phone rings, and it's, "Peter, I'm just in Singapore. I just thought I'd ring you and say good luck." So another of those moments of oh my God. So he was the president. We can hear that. Just a few things. Peter will be glad to know I'm nearly finished as well. So there were a few things that have changed. I don't know anyone who worked in transplant will remember the chart. The chart. This was like the big thing like this, that you wrote the patient's name. This, if you fouled this up or even had to tip exit, this was like major crime. But the chart was brilliant. I really missed the chart. It's just all the results, days, every single thing here. You could get the chart and you could just see the whole thing all in one go. So the chart went, didn't it? Sadly. Yeah. I think we should have some framed ones. The transition from surgical care, primarily with obviously the support of a lot of the nephrology colleagues, but there was a transition one after I was consultant, and he was there, to a more nephrology driven post-operative care. That was definitely something that he would have seen as a change. Surgery was simplified a lot. I mean, it was really quite complicated, the way they were doing it before. They would divide the internal iliac vein, they would bring up the whole vein up. This early days, they even divide the spermatic cord on that side, and they mobilized long length. I remember assisting Peter Morrison. He was doing this huge wound and exposure and bringing everything up and using the internal iliac artery. That has moved on. It's much simpler, and it's interesting you cover the laparoscopic donor nephrectomy, because I didn't know that he had reservations, but actually that's obviously been a major advance. And then just some of the legacy issues are going to be covered. So obviously, but there's some that I think that he would have liked. I think the whole, from Alan Ting through, Sue Bugle and now on to Martin, he loved the science and the rigor of the tissue typing. He was always into the HLA and the humoral side of the transplantation. That was, and Phil Mason, with the ABO incompatibility and the desensitization, again, clinical, working on that same side of transplantation, and the whole tolerance effect, which is still, it's just there. There are still Oxford trials ongoing and looking at that, and obviously that's something, because that sort of relates to what I did. And then this picture, you're going to see this again. This is my final slide. That was him. That's a great picture of him, because he was humorous and he was suitably scary. Coming back to the scary bit, but it was in a positive scariness, in that it encouraged you to be better. And I think he'd be delighted, that to see some of the people here today, looking down and seeing that the transplant unit has moved on so much, both in volume, but also in the results and all the things that he did. His underlying personality, I think, is still stamped on the transplant unit and people who've worked before and after. Thank you.
So anyway, it's a great pleasure to be able to chair the second session. I'm David Cranston, and I'll speak a little bit later. But first speaker is Professor Dame Fiona Powrie. Fiona was in the Nuffield Department of Surgery between 96 and 2001, I think. She was then Truelove Professor of Gastroenterology in Oxford and currently is head of the Kennedy Institute of Rheumatology. Fiona, thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you very much for those of you involved in the organisation for inviting me to participate. I mean, it really is an honour to be able to contribute to such a lovely celebration of Peter Morris's academic life. As you would have heard from that brief introduction, you may have picked up that I've worked in 4 Oxford departments. Now, that may say something about me, but it has given me a chance to work with different heads of department. And I must say that Peter Morris holds a special place in my heart as head of department. Absolutely outstanding, encouraging and warm individual. So what I wanted to do was just go through some personal experiences of my journey. And actually, as I think about how that has influenced or been affected by interactions with Peter, there are really several points of intersection beyond the time that I was actually working in the Department of Surgery. One is that the pioneering work that he was doing on transplantation immunology with Don Mason at the Dunn School was really an inspiration for me to apply for a PhD to work with Don in the late 80s. And in fact, that was a bit of a rescue, one I'm really quite grateful for, because I had left university, don't tell anyone, to go into accountancy. So I sort of had a turnaround back into science. And of course, I think that was one of the most important decisions. The other is that a decade later, quite out of the blue, a sort of story of serendipity, Peter ended up offering me the opportunity to start my own independent lab in the Nuffield Department of Surgery. He got me out of a bit of a bind at that time, and I'll tell you about that. But that was really also a very important sort of interaction. The other, and perhaps sort of really one that had a huge amount of impact on me, was actually a more personal interaction. It was in the early days of my PhD, and my mother was suffering from lupus. She was very ill throughout my childhood with relapsing and remitting disease. Of course, there's not much more we can offer lupus patients today, sadly, but she was in a very serious stage with renal complications. And I was a budding immunologist and thought there must be something more we could do here. So I plucked up the courage late at night. It was all quite a desperate situation to phone the head of the unit that I was working, the cell immunology unit at the Dun School. Alan Williams, an Australian, and I think a good friend of Peter Morris's. And Alan listened, said, "You've got to talk to Peter Morris. I'll call him." And I didn't know Peter Morris as a student. And the next thing, even later, Peter was phoning well, I don't know what we can do, but I want you to talk to a young nephrologist, Peter Ratcliffe, and how all these things have come round. And of course, that was Peter showing that empathy, humanity and care. And he didn't even know me. So that really had quite an impact. So when we talk about the Nuffield Department of Surgery, and I'll be sort of thinking about that period in the late 80s into the early 2000s that I was associated with it, of course, that was a department, a world-leading department of surgery. But what made it unique, and of course, we've had some sort of people alluding to this, but I think Peter's leadership and vision as he assembled a multidisciplinary team to tackle the challenges and opportunities in transplantation at that time. And I think one thing that stood out to me when I was a student working with Don, there were lots of interactions with the Nuffield Department of Surgery and the transplantation immunology, was that Peter really appreciated discovery science. And he and Don and others, Maggie Dolman, Catherine Wood, and many, really defined transplantation immunology, working out the cellular characteristics that were involved with rejection, the MHC components, an area that, of course, Peter was very actively involved in. So the Nuffield Department of Surgery had immunologists, molecular biologists, geneticists next to surgeons and clinicians. And in fact, many of us in this room who were not in transplantation worked in the Nuffield Department of Surgery. And I think that's really a front runner of multidisciplinarity. It was ahead of the game, thinking about bringing these different skill sets to bear to sort of advance transplantation sciences. The other the areas that I think he showed a lot of foresight in supporting individuals, of course, as we said, he didn't do all this alone. This was building a team of talented people from around the world. But from the early work on the sort of components of the immune system involved in rejection, the work from Catherine Wood's group, building understanding of the blood transfusion effect and actually taking that to the point of being able to identify MHC components that were driving that effect. I mean, still not completely understood, but it did bring the department, and in fact, when I was in the department, my work there, looking at how the immune system is able to actively regulate the response. Prior to studies on regulatory T cells, we focused on immune activation, but it's also quite clear that there are arms of the immune system devoted to immune suppression, something that I've worked on throughout my career. And of course, Peter brought that into the thinking on transplantation immunology. And I think, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, that was actually quite controversial. T suppressor cells. What developed in regulatory T cells is actually not built on the original T suppressor cell literature, but Peter was willing to think about these things and encourage their sort of encourage a formal research-led assessment. And of course, there are now trials in this area. And I see Fadi Issa at the back. They're sort of pioneering the Treg approach in transplantation, and it'd be great to get a bit of an update on that. The other thing, Peter Morris attracted John Austin to the Nuffield Department of Surgery, and of course John Austin had been doing pioneering work with the Nobel Prize winner Ralph Steinman in characterizing, identifying specialized subsets of immune cells called dendritic cells that are a form of antigen presenting cell and are a very important component of how the graft is able to sensitize the immune system. So the Nuffield Department of Surgery at that time had absolutely world-leading immunology as well as immunogenetics, next to the sort of cutting-edge transplantation components. And I think that's the next sort of unique element I wanted to mention of the Nuffield Department of Surgery and of Peter's vision and leadership, was again a front runner of translational medicine. I mean, we all aspire to do translational medicine now, and bringing clinicians and surgeons next to discovery scientists. But it's not easy to do that. It still isn't easy. I think these groups talk different languages, and it really is about building a community of mutual respect and integration and iteration. I think no one is better than the other amongst those, and they can add value. And Peter really saw that. And the Nuffield Department of Surgery that I joined was a group of scientists, discovery scientists, clinician scientists, and surgeons, where there was a true dialogue and interaction. And of course, after going from surgery, leading my own group from surgery to the Dunn School, I took a move to establish a translational gastroenterology unit. I guess that was around 2009. And actually what I'd learned in surgery was really important for thinking about the foundations of that, because that involved moving my discovery research lab and mouse experiments from a fundamental discovery type of institute, the Dunn School, to the heart of the gastroenterology department in the John Radcliffe Hospital. And that was a risk. I remember colleagues saying, "I'm not going to go and work up the hill, are you? You know, have to interact with all those clinicians and surgeons and things." But actually, that was really, at that stage, I think, a challenge to bring the discovery next to the translational components in gastroenterology. And of course, surgery had been doing that for a long time. In fact, that you might ask, I mean, I'm an immunologist. I work on the gut. I work on how the immune system interacts with all of those microbes that colonize our body surfaces and support health. And when that breaks down, it can drive disease. How did I end up working in the Nuffield Department of Surgery? Well, actually, that's a sort of, as I said, a tale of serendipity. And I don't know if John Todd is still there. He's over there. I had finished my finishing up my postdoctoral studies at the DNAX Research Institute in California. It was a really exciting time. We were moving from cellular immunology to molecular immunology and characterizing the way in which immune cells communicate. And that is in part through molecules called cytokines, and DNAX was cloning these and thinking about how they would be new therapeutics. And my husband and I, and we had a new daughter at that time, had made the decision to move back to the UK. I was working through the Wellcome Trust Senior Fellowship Programme. A preliminary application was going forward for a full application. And at that point, my Oxford sponsor disappeared. It's another story I won't be going into here. But I was in California with no place to go to. So should I just stay in America? Which actually wasn't all that appealing, really. I wanted to come back to the UK, but I did want to come to Oxford. I felt the type of work I did, the Oxford, sort of the scope and depth of science would be the right place. And as it happened, John Todd, who, an outstanding geneticist working in the field of autoimmune disease, in the Nuffield Department of Surgery. So again, you know, why was John working in the Nuffield Department of Surgery? It was visiting DNAX, and he came in to see me, and we were chatting about it. I said, I'd like to come back to the UK, but you know, it's just not looking very likely. What, they under offering you? Yeah, that's what they always do. You know, you need to up this and up that. So no, it's not the offer. It's the sponsorship. Oh, well, I'll just phone Peter. I mean, you come to the Nuffield Department of Surgery. And John phoned Peter, and it wasn't decided on the spot, but Peter offered a home for me to come to, Peter Morris. It was outside of the work, really, that he was doing. But as it happened, the work, when I came there, linking in with what Catherine Wood was doing, we published a number of publications together. And I think actually there was quite a bit of added value in what I was doing then with what the department were doing. So that was a really important step. When I came to the Nuffield Department of Surgery, I must say, when I thought, well, I'm coming to surgery, I knew roughly about the Department of Surgery from my time as a PhD student. And I expected a sort of fairly male dominated environment. And of course, surgery is, in the practical aspect, certainly was then. But when I came to the Department of Surgery, there were as many female PIs as male. And actually a wonderful supportive environment for an early stage scientist developing their lab, and an infrastructure that actually worked. I see Nigel Rust is here, and Nigel was crucial in delivering really spot on cell sorting, so we could get all our little cells, different subsets that we love to do as immunologists. And that was all, Nigel had developed that. The Department of Surgery also, I think we should have a call out for the administrative staff. I met Stella Keeble there, I don't know where she is, absolutely lifelong friend. And Stella was really instrumental in getting us on track in terms of how to budget and operate our labs. Prior to that, Peter had operated a bit of a socialist system in terms of the grant funding component, in that all of the grants went into a pot and got sort of divided out. I didn't think the Wellcome Trust would be too keen on that as a fellow. And also, I think it's quite a good training for you to have to work within your means. And Stella helped me to actually get on track with that. So I just want to finish a little bit with what an outstanding environment the Nuffield Department of Surgery was. We had a tea room that many of you would remember. We would all collect sitting around the tea room, and lots of social plots were hatched. And Peter Morris would come down and chat to people. He really had the most, and it's been alluded to, amazing ability to strike up personal interactions with individuals. When Peter spoke to you, you felt $1 million. He really did make you feel special, because he had captured aspects and asked about them, your family, various other more personal aspects. And he was always very keen to discuss with me some of the sporting things, which is, sort of fairly short conversation to be. But, he had, Stella and I had started playing golf. And Peter was always asking, how's that golf going? My daughter was a sort of competitive tennis player. How's Cara doing in the tennis? And so on. And Peter, I don't know where you are now, but he looks fantastic there. That's so him. I think he'd be delighted to know that Cara, my eldest daughter, is a professional golfer. So she obviously picked up something of what was going on in the medical department of surgery. Anyway, I will finish there. It's been a pleasure to be able to say these words in celebration of a really exceptional, outstanding person. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor John Bell, who, as I'm sure most of us know, is Regius Professor of Medicine in the university. Not sure, John, when you were in the NDS, but you were at some stage. You were.
We were on,
Yeah, I know.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks so much for asking me to come and say a few words. My job was to really talk today about Peter's influence on the University of Oxford. And of course, this was the institution that he committed the majority of his professional career to. And you all know that he had a massive impact and a long-lasting legacy on Oxford. And I'd like to just go over some of those aspects. He's emerged actually as being one of the great figures in the history of Oxford medicine. And that's no small feat, given the fact that people like William Osler and multiple Nobel Prize winners have passed through as part of the medical faculty here over literally hundreds of years. But when you look back, the crucial role Peter has played was to really bring Oxford medicine more into the modern world and created a really unique environment at the medical school that I think is still the envy of many other medical schools around the world. Now, the background of this, I won't go into in detail because many of you know it, but, having started in Australia, one of the key things was he was exposed through Macfarlane Burnet to the emerging field of immunology. Macfarlane Burnet, of course, was a Nobel Prize winner alongside Peter Medawar, and would make some really seminal contributions to the field. And the roots of modern immunology run pretty deep in Australia, and Peter was clearly substantially influenced. But he also had the opportunity to see the impact of an understanding of immunology and how that might influence transplantation, which again was very much an emerging field. So having trained in surgery, came to the UK, worked at Southampton and then at the Hammersmith, then spent time in the US at the Massachusetts General, which is of course a great pillar of surgical and medical specialty, and then spent some time in Virginia working on immunogenetics. So he had a terrific background, and over that period of time, he made some really important scientific contributions, a couple of which have been alluded to already today. But one was this observation that he made with Paul Terasaki that actually serological responses to transplants were responsible for acute rejection. And so understanding the serological nature of acute rejection was a really fundamental step. And Bob Montgomery, of course, referred to this as a really central piece of the puzzle. And the second one is this really curious phenomena of protection of grafts from previous blood transfusion, which still, in my view, hasn't been resolved. But nevertheless, he dabbled in really powerful and important science and had made major contributions to those areas. And then he was ready to log in and become a professor of surgery in Australia and disappear from view forever. And he got a phone call from Richard Dole. So I think people haven't probably recognized, I think, how fundamental Richard Dole, who was then the Regius Professor, was an epidemiologist, did fundamental work on smoking and cancer, how important he was in building the Oxford of today. And the Oxford Medical School of today. But because the medical school is 70% of the university, it's actually the Oxford of today that he was building in the 70s. And he had spotted something which I think was really something that you wouldn't expect an epidemiologist to spot, to be honest. But that is that medicine and medical research was moving on the basis of strong basic science to a science that actually had a translational component, where you move the basic science, you use that to make clinical decisions and test and evaluate things in a clinical setting. And of course, you can't really do that without patients. And so the whole shift in biomedical science globally was beginning to move in that direction. And it hadn't really moved in the UK in that direction. And Peter, David Weatherall, Alec Turnbull, a number of people that Richard Dahl had recruited were the ones who actually pushed the science in Oxford in that direction. Now, there had been terrific medical science in Oxford for centuries, really. And it was all really based around basic science departments in South Parks Road. So what Richard had conceived was that we should be building a set of clinical departments that could actually do the science. But historically, clinicians that did science weren't particularly scientifically competent. They were quite good at making patients feel good when they're at the bedside. They did the pulse really well. Occasionally, blood pressure, which is of course an irreproducible data set. So, but that was all fine. But the truth is that it was going to have to move, and it was going to have to become much more scientifically founded. So, I think it's a real time of change in Oxford, where Richard Dahl, utilizing the Nuffield chairs, which had been donated to the university to support the evolution of clinical science departments, medicine, surgery, obstetrics, anesthetics, and orthopedics. Richard systematically began to fill those with really outstanding people who fulfilled this vision that they could work across basic science and into the clinic. So Peter was really a crucial recruit in that time frame, and he had all those criteria. He was a really strong scientist, but he was also an outstanding surgeon and clinician. And when he arrived, he sort of settled in, and of course stayed in that chair for the remainder of his academic professional career, and really made a massive contribution to the reputation of the medical school. And operating at the cutting edge of immunology, he was able to really change the way people thought about surgeons. Now, I won't tell you what they thought about surgeons before, but now they're highly, highly regarded because they can do lots of things. They can do manual things, they can do clinical things, but they can also do science things. And that change occurred over that period when Peter arrived. Now, of course, after he arrived, he also became a bit of a magnet for other immunologists. So there was an outstanding immunology program at the Dunn School at the time, which was great. Jim Gowans, Alan Williams, who sadly died prematurely, but there was a really outstanding program there. Lots of mice. Peter obviously was stepping into an area which was much more clinically related. And so there was an immediate attraction to immunologists to start to think about that as a place that they might develop and evolve their careers. And many of the names have been mentioned. Fiona spoke before me, a really good example, but Catherine Wood, of course, has been a rock solid bit of that immunology program. John Todd, a great colleague of mine at Stanford, came back and joined the team. Alan Ting, there were a whole host of really talented immunologists that were attracted to the magnet that Peter was, because Peter was, he didn't say if you don't work on kidney transplantation, I'm not interested. He was interested in people who worked on immunology, because that's what he was really engaged with. So partly as a result of that, immunology really began to evolve in the clinical school. And that has been an evolution which has led to the position which we're now in, which is probably the single greatest strengths of this medical school, and indeed arguably this university, is the strengths we've got in immunology. that was helped and facilitated by the return of Andrew McMichael, who spent some time at Stanford. Andrew came back, parked his lab on level 6, supported, I think, Andrew, you came back to NDS, I think, didn't you? As did I. So when I was looking to come back from California, Peter put his hand up and said, come back to the NDS. So, you know, almost all of the starters of this big revolution passed through Peter's department and received an incredibly warm welcome. And Peter, I think, had a view which was a really good view for us returners. And that is, I think his philosophy was recruit really good people and then just leave them alone and let them get on with it. And it's a rule that I think I still try and follow, because it's where you get the best results. And so immunology is really Oxford's premier area of expertise. Peter has had a major contribution to having established that. And this is where a bit of serendipity comes into play, because in those days, immunology was really autoimmune diseases, complicated, may take a while to get to the bottom of those. Infectious diseases, which we were good about, and particularly with the global health stuff that we'd done, and transplantation. So that was basically immunology. But we built this great platform of immunology basically around the things that Andrew and Peter and others supported. And of course, it's now turned out that immunology is at the heart of almost all diseases. So neurodegeneration is probably immunologically mediated. Cardiometabolic disease is immunologically mediated. The treatment for cancer will almost all be immunological in the near future. So we, in a sense, we rather luckily, partly due to Peter, landed on the right square, and that's been a terrific run. He received lots of scientific accolades, elected to the Royal Society, fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and the likes, but also remained very active clinically and stayed at the cutting edge of clinical practice. I mean, he was regularly in the operating theater. He was a very active clinician, and he kept his credibility among surgeons by being somebody who could actually operate highly effectively. And that meant that he was extraordinarily busy, but he was almost never stressed. I never saw Peter visibly stressed. He was unbelievably calm. He had a really relaxed, sort of laconic style. And he would always stop in the corridors to talk and say, oh, what's up? What are you doing? I mean, it was a remarkable set of personal characteristics, because it actually provided his input into a lot of people, many of them very junior to him, but he would always pay attention to them. And it's a great aspect of his style. I remember really vividly, I was a house officer working for David Weatherall as it happened, and David had a patient with thalassemia who needed a spleen up, and Peter did this splenectomy. And then David said, would you mind keeping an eye on the lady overnight and just making sure that surgeons don't screw it up? So I said, yeah. So anyway, I got a call, this was about midnight, from the nurse saying, yeah, we came down and see Mrs. So-and-so. She seems to be getting much larger. So I thought, okay, I may be a physician, but that doesn't sound good. And so I popped down to the bedside and found that not only did she have been getting larger, but her blood pressure had been going lower. I thought, okay, we have a problem here. So I called the registrar and I said, I think we've got a problem. I think this lady's got a bleed. And the registrar said, the prof did that operation. There's no way she has a bleed. That is never. I said, you sure? I said, yeah, don't worry. Just go back to bed, it'll all be fine. So, of course, the nurse ringing me up every 20 minutes. Oh, God. So anyway, so I called, after about an hour, I called the registrar again. And I said, look, I really think you better get in here. Either both you and I are going to be in big trouble. So anyway, he lived out in some godforsaken place. So he said, well, it'll take me 40 minutes on the motorcycle to get in. I think you should call a professor. So talk about dodging the bullet. So here I am, junior house officer, about to call the professor of surgery and tell him that he forgot to tie something off. So that, I thought, this is probably not going to go too well. So anyway, I rang him, and it was, by this stage, about 2 o'clock in the morning. And that's obviously not an easy thing to do, but Peter answered the phone, crisp and clear. Yeah, okay. That long laconic style. He said, oh, I think we got a problem. I'll be right in. And about 20 minutes later, he was standing there, ready to go. Of course, it was a bleed, and he operated on her, fixed it all up. And then at the end of the evening, early hours of the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, he came out of the operating theater and said, okay, yeah, we've got all that done. Let's go for breakfast. And then we hauled our way down to the hospital canteen, which is no better than it is now. We sat and had a big fry up in the morning. But, you know, it's a remarkable character to actually do that. And that stuck with me. I was a very junior guy. I don't even think he knew who I was. But anyway, that was a remarkable experience. So I had a spell, thanks to Andy McMichael, I had a spell with Hugh McDevitt in California, which was, again, a pretty life-changing event, because Stanford in the 80s was just a remarkable place. All the tools of molecular biology descended. Everybody was thinking about starting up companies and doing really exciting science. Fiona was there at DNAX, and we were in Stanford. John Todd was with me. It was a really fantastic time. And then I hadn't, to be honest, really thought hard about coming back to Oxford, but David Weatherall called me up and said, oh, well, look, the Wellcome Trust just cashed in its chips and they've got quite a lot of money. So why don't you come back for 5 years? It'd be fine. In those days, the Wellcome ran senior fellowship programs, which many of us were on. So I put in an application for that. And then it emerged that David, who'd been very gracious about saying, come on back, he was a hemoglobin guy. He was a red cell guy. So the white cell thing didn't really ring very many bells for David. And then it turned out that he'd invited me back. I wanted to run a fellowship, and there was no space. So I thought, okay, that's not going too well. So Peter said, look, why don't you come and poke yourself in the NDS? And I said, well, I'm not sure you got much space, Peter. So anyway, he squeezed up people just to give me a couple of benches. And the IMM was being built, so I thought, well, there's future here. It'll all be fine. But I think one of the things that, I mean, Peter was hugely helpful and supportive of getting me landed, getting me started, getting me going in Oxford. But it's really important to realize what an exciting time this actually was in Stanford, because in Oxford, because everything was moving really quickly. You've gone from having this clinical faculty of doctors in the hospital who were not scientists to a whole cadre of scientists who were also doing clinical medicine in the new hospital up the hill, lots of people coming and going from abroad, and a massive expansion in activity with lots and lots of new people, a lot of people with really interesting backgrounds, and a very large number of non-British people like myself. So, which was kind of helpful, because Peter was sort of fell into that camp, and you won't be surprised that we were pretty irreverent about everything, including the cricket. But it was a really, really exciting and interesting time. But there was a real gap between what Oxford used to be and what Peter and David and others and Andrew were trying to make it in the future. And, you know, there was the old buildings, all that's all fine. But the way the organization ran itself was incredibly old school and very, very clunky. And and then the colleges were the colleges, you know, Peter was a Balliol, very loyal to Balliol. You know, the truth is that it wasn't entirely obvious how they were going to contribute to this new agenda. And you know, I had just come back from Stanford, and I was thinking, whoa, I'm not so sure about this. How are they ever going to get this to be up to date and look like Stanford? Well, it wasn't clearly going to look like Stanford. And I remember I became a fellow at Magdalen, which was my college when I was an undergraduate. Anyway, they said, oh, we got a college meeting. I said, Wednesday. I said, Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I said, you got to be joking. Wednesday afternoon, I got some things I got to do at Wednesday afternoon. I said, oh, no, you're a fellow of the college. You got to come down to this thing. So anyway, I remember I kind of drifted in, and everybody had their gowns on. It was a dimly lit room with all the fellows. You could smell the sweet sherry everywhere. People drifting off to sleep. Boy, you know, this is, remember, a year before I'd been windsurfing in San Francisco Bay. So this was a very, very big change. Anyway, they then started, first item on the agenda. We've got one computer for the students. Should we buy a second one? And that was a big debate, and in the end, they decided one was probably enough. This is 1988, so it wasn't. This was not 1960. Anyway, so that was good. And then, of course, it was usually one main item on the college agenda, and on this occasion, the big item was what to do with William of Waynfleet's socks. So William of Waynfleet founded the college. He left a lot of things, including socks. And there was a big debate about how to best preserve his socks. And there was a debate about whether they should be in the old library, the new library, or where was more. Anyway, that went on for about an hour and a quarter. I can't believe it. By now it's about 5 o'clock. Oh, bloody hell, this is really it. Anyway, that was the old school view. And meanwhile, up the hill, you know, Peter in the operating theater, lots of activity, lots of science, lots of new young people coming in, completely different approach to the world. But Peter really did help drive that. And, you know, with many of the people who came in over that time, I think we all had a really important role in changing the fundamentals of Oxford. So the other thing that Oxford did, Peter did over that period, was he did recognize the importance of the Churchill Hospital. And, you know, he built his transplant center because it was close to the renal unit. It was the right place to put it. But we also all recognized that the Churchill was, in a sense, an asset that hadn't really been properly exploited. Now, over time, it become increasingly exploited. But I had certainly recognized that. And it was a conversation that Peter and I had on more than one occasion. So when I became the Nuffield Chair of Medicine, which was Peter's opposite number in medicine, following David Weatherall, I looked around, and in Peter's department and in David's department, or in the Nuffield Department of Medicine, we had about 6 or 8 of the world leading people in the field of human genetics as it was emerging. So human genetics was now really emerging at speed. John Todd was one. We brought Mark Lathrop in. Bill Cookson was there. Adrian Hill was there. Tony Monaco. We had a whole cadre of people. And the Wellcome had just cashed in their chips. They just sold their shares in the Wellcome PLC to Glaxo, and had landed about 10.5 billion of money into the endowment. So I approached Peter and I said, look, there's an opportunity now. We should just strike and see if we can get some money for a new building. So we cooked it up and we wrote an application to the Wellcome Trust. Now, the university administration in those days was fairly loose and floppy and not very coherent. So we basically sent the application off to the Wellcome without telling the university we'd done. That didn't go over so well in the coming months, but that was how it got started. Because of course we got a response back saying, gosh, we really like this idea, so why don't you come up and talk to us? So we all went up and pitched the story. They had a review committee on it. So it got funded. So that was the Wellcome Trust Center of Human Genetics. And Peter was definitely a very tight and important ally. He was a co-applicant on the grant. And now it then got a bit choppy because, of course, the university got a bit angry that we hadn't talked to them about it. But that was okay. Peter North was vice chancellor. He was very supportive. And then the Wellcome does what they always do. They wobbled a bit back and forth. But Peter was such a great ally over that period. He just kept everybody calm. And in the end, of course, we got the money, and that we planted on the Churchill site, and has now been basically the nidus for this massive development of space and capacity on that site, which has really carried the clinical school, the medical school, and the university to ever new heights. So I think it's really important to recognize how central Peter was to all these developments over a relatively short time frame that really changed the way Oxford thought about these subjects, thought about medicine, and thought about its clinical school. And he was absolutely central to that. And throughout his career was just a key advocate for that agenda. I can still remember Saturday mornings, they had the clinical faculty board down in Wellington Square. Everybody rocked up early on Saturday morning, and Peter and David Weatherall used to essentially drive the whole agenda for that board, and took us to really very exciting places. It was a very exciting time. So I just like to end on a more personal note, and that is that, you know, Peter, for me, was a remarkable mentor. He was a great collaborator and a great colleague. And I did all those things, from being a medical student all the way to being his equivalent number in the Department of Medicine. And he was always terrific to work with, regardless of the level that you were at. That was almost irrelevant to him. He never tried to grab the limelight. He was always there supporting what you were trying to do. It was really, really helpful to have him at my side. Obviously, I couldn't contribute much to the sporting activities in the department because I was a rower and he definitely wasn't a rower, but we did talk sport pretty regularly. His life post-Oxford, of course, was also equally important and exciting. I'm not going to talk about that, but I just think I wanted to leave you with the notion that actually Oxford Medicine, which has been for 12 years the leading medical school on the planet, that transition took place with Peter and David in particular over those crucial years in the 70s and 80s. And it's continued on that trajectory. But, you know, the hardest thing is to get on that trajectory in the first place. And it was they who set it on that route. And many of us have just picked up what they set out to do and have been running with the ball ever since. So thanks very much.
It's great pleasure to introduce Neil Mortentsen, who's recently been president of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. But Neil and I first met, I think, in 1979 when I was his SHO and he was senior registrar, and he taught me how to do bowel surgery and many other things, and also passed FRCS.
Thank you very much, David. And it is a great honour to be speaking at this meeting. I've learned lots and lots this morning. We're in silos in the hospital, and I'm so pleased to hear all those things about Peter. And of course, it's a great honour to follow him as president of the Royal College of Surgeons. If we can have the slides up, please. This picture that you're seeing is actually his portrait. When the president gets to the end of their term, they're invited to have a portrait of themselves made. And this is Peter's, and it's a very beautiful picture. I think you'll all agree. Couple of things to say about it. Number one, he's not pompous. He's not wearing a gown. Number two, I think that picture above him is Lord Lister. I think I'm right. He has to be the most eminent surgeon who's ever been president of the Royal College of Surgeons. He was already knighted. He was already a fellow of the Royal Society. And he is actually more distinguished than Lister, because Lister was never, ever president of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. He was a vice president, fell out with council, and went off in a gruff. Peter there is wearing the college tie, and he's also holding the badge of office of the president. Now, we've all come to realize that a surgical life is more than just surgery and technical things. I'm not going to read all these things out. Many of us are lucky enough to have 2 or 3 of these things as part of our surgical skill set. I have to say, Peter enjoyed and demonstrated every single one of them. A very, very remarkable person. Now, he was a council member in 1992 and vice president in 1998. And this, rather as JB has been describing, is a venerable institution which hadn't changed over centuries. And so when he became president, things had to change. Now, I'm just going to briefly divert and tell you a little bit about the folklore of the Royal College of Surgeons. It is, becoming president, a little like being made the Pope. The council members sit in a closed room, and if you're only if you're there, can you actually take part in the voting. And there are rounds of voting. Small slips are put in a box, and the person who has the most votes each time does not immediately become president. They have to have a majority of votes, but also the last two people drop out. So often it can go round and round and round several times, maybe on occasion over an hour and a half as this voting goes around. Of course, it has been described too as a blood sport because all the people who are desperately wanting to be president are also in the room at the same time. And to cut a long story short, Peter became president by one vote. Now, as his picture showed, he wasn't a pompous person, and he certainly didn't want to do it for the frippery. He wasn't that keen on the ceremonial. He wasn't that keen on wearing the robes, but he brought those same qualities we've heard about from the Nuffield Department of Surgery to the college too. Inside the college, he was very, very well respected and liked. He knew all the staff by name. Once again, same thing. He confronted the frustrations of working with his surgically qualified council colleagues. And you've already heard there's a little bit of the socialist in Peter. Many of the big names in London were not only very fine surgeons with a huge reputation, but they also had huge private practices. Those opposing views of the surgical world would sometimes come into conflict. And as you've maybe read in David's book, he also had Sky Sports in the President's office. I'm very, very grateful to Martin Coomer, who's in the audience, who at that time was head of the research department. It was called the secretary of the research department. Actually, Martin Coomer really ran the college. He also looked after Peter, and Peter, before the days of Teams and modern communications, made it his job to go around and find out what was really happening on the ground. Went to all these hospitals, met the managers, met the senior surgical and medical staff, met the nursing staff and so on, so that he could properly represent what was happening in surgery nationally. Now, the College of Surgeons building, which I've shown you in the first two pictures, also has next to it something called the Nuffield College of Surgical Sciences, which was built just after the Second World War, partly with money from Lord Nuffield. And it housed the Institute of Basic Sciences, which was at that time run by the University of London. So there were independent scientific groups working in this building next to the College of Surgeons under the overall umbrella of the College of Surgeons. But it was clear it's becoming too expensive. They were working in isolation, and the University of London was withdrawing its support. So Michael Peckham was brought in to have a look at how that could work better in the future. And those departments were all relocated to medical schools. And then the then president, Sir Norman Brow, suggested that instead there should be some sort of research fellowship scheme to promote the surgeons of the future, and particularly the surgeon scientists of the future. And Peter was called in to be its first chair. Now, JB has already alluded to the fact that surgeons in the past haven't been great scientists or researchers. And this famous paper in the Lancet by Richard Horton, Surgical Science or Comic Opera, that was the way we were seen. And much as we've heard already, Peter was instrumental in changing that for surgery and making the surgical research team what it is today. This is a chapter on him describing the research fellowship scheme of the college. So I've said he became chair in 1993, and here we are, 2003, its 10th anniversary, the front page of the annual research report. Here's another example from 2012. And then just to summarize, this research fellowship scheme is the jewel in the crown of the college. 45 million has been raised from various donors and friends over the last 20 years. 2.5 million in the most recent round. We give out around 40 fellowships per year. Many of those get converted to PhDs, around 85, 90%. And many of those people who've done a research fellowship become the leaders and shakers and movers of the future surgical profession. As part of all this, he brought in both funders and also some rigor around the peer review process and the assessment of the success of those research fellowships. The other area where he made a massive difference is in the clinical effectiveness unit. This was a joint operation between the Royal College of Surgeons and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he asked Sir Richard to come in and help him create something which would provide the evidence for proper evidence-based surgical practice and audit. And that has been in existence for the last 20 years now. And here we are. The clinical effectiveness unit has become now the centre, based in the College of Surgeons, but with national money, for a new cancer audit collaborating centre, because in the last 10 years, certainly the last 5 years, data around cancer has become a bit of a mess. It needs putting together. And so this is, again, one of the legacies, one of the fruits of Peter's foresight all those years ago. In the transplantation arena, he took part in a national review, which resulted in rationalisation of many of the transplant centres around the country, and also the Centre for Evidence in Transplantation, established in the college in 2005. Now, one of the things that the English College has is some place in strategy and policy in surgery and medicine in the UK. And at the time Peter was president, these were the main players: Tony Blair, New Labour, and John Prescott and Alan Milburn, you can see there. Liam Donson was the chief medical officer. And Nigel Crisp, of course, had been chief executive and then went on to become chief executive of the National Health Service, or NHS England as it's now called. And part of Peter's job was to meet these people. There was a modernisation board, which apparently he was rather reticent to join. He didn't want to be compromised by being part of a team which would maybe make him things he didn't want to agree with. But one of his really major contributions was around surgical manpower. He got a message to Tony Blair. Tony Blair spoke to Milburn, and basically he pointed out that without more surgical trainees, there was going to be a huge problem with surgical manpower, person power in the coming years. And the Prime Minister's office and Department of Health agreed, and that that resulted in a huge increase in training numbers in surgery. He was never sure how influential he was as president of the College of Surgeons. Nonetheless, in The Economist in 2002, he was listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the UK. I'm showing this slide because this is one of the things he was very unhappy about with for a while. The college building was badly destroyed during the Second World War and was rebuilt, reopened in 1962 by Her Majesty the Queen. The problem was the wonder material in those days was asbestos. And you've seen in other Oxford buildings what happens if you find asbestos. Many of our colleagues, senior colleagues, felt very, very strongly that the building should be refurbished. It soon became clear that that wasn't possible. And so this is 2019, the back of it being demolished. The front had to be kept because it's a listed building. And Peter at first was opposed to this on the grounds that A, would be too expensive, B, there must be a better way of doing it. But I have to say, when I told him about the asbestos problem, he did finally agree that things had to move on, and it was the best policy. It was reopened in 2022, and now this famous picture of Henry VIII by Holbein giving the seal of royal assent to the Barber Surgeons and the Company of Surgeons in 1542. There is a brand new Hunterian Museum. I'm only showing you this to encourage you to go and see it. There is a robot in the hallway to symbolize the future of surgery. And of course, you can see Peter's picture there too. It's on a staircase above a statue of John Hunter. On the opposite side of the hallway is the Hunterian Museum. Do come and visit it. This final slide is a thank you from me. When I became president, Peter sent me a lovely note He said, "I'm so glad we got you to Oxford, and I think you'll do a fantastic job." He's done a fantastic job for surgery, done a great job for me. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, a lot has been said about Peter, and I will say a few more things about him, but I'd also like to pay tribute to a number of women in his life, and not least of all Joss, who's lovely to have her here at the beginning. Peter So Peter accepted the job in Oxford at the end of 1973, and as we've already heard, Adelaide were wanting to have him there, and they were getting a bit agitated because he hadn't told them anything, and he hadn't heard anything from Oxford. So he rang the registrar at Oxford University to ask what had happened and what was happening about the post. And they said that since the last of his 29 conditions that he put when he was wanting to come here had been fulfilled, they just assumed that it was guaranteed that he would accept it. And anyway, it was announced in the Times the day before. And apparently that's what also happened to David Weatherall. They said, you know, my dear boy, it was in the Times. What more do you want? So it was always a joy to operate with Peter, who was courteous and very calm, just like his mentor, Claude Welsh. And for many years, I did the living donor transplants, and he put the kidney into the recipient, although on his 55th birthday, I was senior registrar and I was doing a donor with Joe Smith, my senior colleague, and I'd put a tie on the renal artery and the renal vein, and Peter was scrubbed, and Joe said to Peter, "Oh, Peter, you're scrubbed, come and take the kidney out." So Peter cut the artery and the vein, and within 30 seconds, the tie had come off the artery and the tie had come off the vein. So Joe said to me, "I thought you got good ties on that." I said, "Yes, I thought I had too." But anyway, Peter still remained calm, but sort of 4 hours later and a splenectomy later and about 14 units of blood later, I sort of crawled out of theatre and couldn't get to sleep that night. And ever since then, I've never let anybody else take the kidney out. I've always put 2 ties on before the artery's cut. Dilly Little is a transplant surgeon in Ireland who was with us for a while, and she was operating with Peter one day, and apparently Peter had his hands in the operating wound, and she's the only person I've ever known who's actually took an instrument and just tapped him on the hand and said, "Peter, get your hands out." I don't think anybody else would have dreamed of doing that. So when Peter started work on the 4th of August 1974, he walked into his office to be greeted by Joan Cracknell, who'd also been, as we've heard, Philip Allison's secretary, and she pointed to a letter on the desk which said, "Dear Peter, welcome to Oxford. I'm sure you'll have a marvellous time. I'm just down the corridor in the laboratory if you want to drop in for a cup of coffee. Sincerely, Hans Krebs." And Peter said, firstly, he never understood the citric acid cycle, and secondly, he thought that Krebs was dead. But he was still jogging at 75, apparently. Well, Joan had been around the Radcliffe Infirmary for a long time, and she knew everybody, and she guided all the newcomers, including the new professor, around all the numerous dangerous reefs in the hospital sea. And in 1983, I was a young surgical registrar in Bath, and I'd heard that there was a job coming up in Oxford, Hanson Surgical Research job. And Joan was my first contact with Oxford, and I rang her up on a number of occasions asking when this job was going to be advertised, and she was extraordinarily kind and showed no evidence of being annoyed at this junior doctor who kept ringing her up asking her what was happening. And Joss and Joan had these coffee mornings so that partners and young families of new people arriving in Oxford could, or study in the NDS, could just join together. And I'm sure many of us here have experienced that. And my wife, Rosie, attended with initially 2 and then 4 young children. And Mike, who's here, kindly entertained some of my young sons in the garden with a rugby ball. And I think on one occasion, one of our sons, I think it was Timothy, went up to Joan Cracknell quite quietly and said, "I've had 20 biscuits today." So I think Joan probably thought that we never fed the children. And then Rosie helped to run the coffee, my wife helped to run the coffee mornings with Joan, and also Nikki Roke from New Zealand. And having had 5 children, Peter was remarkably relaxed. And on my 50th birthday, a group of us were on a boat steamer from Folly Bridge, and there was a reasonable amount of alcohol on the boat, but actually no food, which was a bit of a mistake. And my 4 sons, some of them teenagers, had quite a lot of alcohol, and one of them was sitting next to Peter, almost falling asleep on his shoulder. And I think he was sick later on. Fortunately, he wasn't sick in Peter's pocket, but it was, Peter seemed totally unfazed. And I was very pleased that I'd already had a consultant job by then. And Joan used to babysit for us on a number of occasions, and she became a great friend over the years. And Brenda, who is here today as well, Brenda Carter came to the department in 1984. And then when Joan retired in 1988, she kept Peter off the straight and narrow as his secretary. And she, with Peter, was beginning to write his autobiography, which sadly he didn't complete, but a lot of what he did write, especially the early days of his life, which would have been very difficult for me to research, were already written and in that book. So they say that behind every great man is a surprised woman, but I think in Peter's case, behind every great man is an even greater woman, because Peter, I'm sure, couldn't have done what he did without Joss, who was a student in the same year at medical school, and she obtained an exhibition in obstetrics and gynecology, and the children would always remind Peter that he was not the brightest in the family. They became engaged in 1959, married on the 4th of February, and Joss was initially planning a career in obstetrics and gynecology, having won those prizes, but she gave that up for Peter. And in 1961, they both headed to England on a cargo boat. And when they arrived in England, they had a little flat in Paddington, which consisted of a single room, the bed folded out from the wall, and the mail used to be delivered, can you believe it, 6 times a day. The first delivery was at 6 a.m. and it would come in and fall on the bed. And then in December 1963, with one son, Peter, and pregnant with Sarah, they flew to a -13-degree Boston winter, where Joyce was able to keep her hand in medically, even with looking after 2 children. And then coming back to Australia with 5 children under the age of 8, the chance of Joss having a career in medicine seemed limited, but she'd learned a lot about physiology in America. And when she came back to Melbourne, she worked part-time in cardiology, doing experimental work for her MD thesis on lung mechanics and lung mechanics after cardiac valve replacement. And in 1973, shortly before arriving in Oxford, she obtained her MD, and given it comprised a clinical exam as well as a written thesis with 5 young children, that was quite an extraordinary achievement. And she also was responsible for finding the house in Lucerne Road with advice from the university architect, knocked down walls, had it rewired, put in central heating, built an extension. Then Peter started work on the garden. And that was the home for the next 50 years, which I'm sure most of us at some stage have visited. Peter and Joss dined at Balliol on many occasions, but there was one occasion when they were at another college in the presence of Omar Sharif. And at the end of the dinner, he made his way around the long dining table in order to kiss her hand and tell her she was a very charming dinner companion. So Peter's energy and drive to transplantation and science were legendary, and it's been a great privilege, like so many of us here, to be working in the NDS and a little part of the history of transplantation in the 20th century. And thank you to Joss for all you did to make that possible. Freddie's just going to close. Freddie is Nuffield Professor of Surgery.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's wonderful, and it's a privilege to be here. I did not know Peter personally until I came to Oxford in 2008. I'm not a transplant surgeon or an immunologist or renal physician. I'm a urologist, which is the kind of lower grade surgeon I think of. When Peter was a giant, I was in my shorts, and I obviously knew of him. And much later on, I was a professor of urology at the University of Sheffield, and I received this famous phone call from Oxford asking me if I was interested in the Nuffield Chair of Surgery here. And I was stunned. I stopped and I said, are you sure of what you're saying? And they said, yes. I said, I've always worked in the north of England. I'm a urologist and I can't speak English properly. And you want me to come to Oxford? And they said, yes, the rest is history. What I found later on is that Peter had been very instrumental in my recruitment, and I will always be very grateful to him. He also told me that not speaking with an English accent in Oxford is an asset rather than the year I came, he used to pay these visits regularly because he wanted to know how the department was going, what my vision was, and how things were. It was always very, very helpful, not intrusive, and he was extremely kind. And one day he said, "There's something which annoys me." I said, "What?" He said, "You're only a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and we need to fix that." And I said, "Peter, I'm not going to go and take new exams now to be a fellow of the English College." He said, "No, leave it with me." And then 3 months later, he made me a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England at Adewundum. So I was very grateful. Also, after a couple of years, I was getting quite concerned because after your excitement of being recruited to Oxford, then you don't hear anything. And nobody was telling me anything. Nobody was telling me whether things were going well or not well. So one day over coffee, I said, "Peter, I'm really worried." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Nobody's telling me anything." He said, "Dear boy, you don't want anyone to tell you anything because if they do, then it's not good. So keep going." The final thing I want to say is that we stayed in contact very closely, despite the pandemic, despite him getting frailer, difficulties with mobility. And I was on sick leave, prolonged sick leave for a while. And even when he was getting frailer and more tired, he never ever failed to continue to make these phone calls to ask me how I was. So everybody was talking about his compassion and the human side of him, and I experienced that firsthand. So Peter is smiling as he's looking at us, and I want to say thank you to his family, to Joss who are here, and thank you to all of you for coming and really remembering him in such a vivid and affectionate way. Thank you.